The biggest contribution intellectually of the Garvey movement is probably the take it has on nationalism. So the Garvey movement sets out to create what they call the global black nation. So the UNA represents all black people. They actually had they had ambassadors, right? They had ambassadors they'd send to different countries. They would write letters. Garvey would write letters to the heads of state as the head of the black world. Sounds a bit grandiose, but actually if you think about the idea, what he's saying here is that the nation the nation of black people cannot be confined to America, to Jamaica, etc. Actually, what makes the nation is the people, and the people have been dispersed. Now, this is really important in the context because black people are in the Caribbean or in America are here now because of slavery, right? Slavery forcibly removes us out. And so the idea is that because of that, we've maintained our connection to Africa, and that is where our responsibility lies. Now, this is really important because it's a very different way and a very challenging way to think about nation. The way that we think about a nation state now, in the current framework, is it's actually a relatively recent, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It's a very Western concept that you have a nation which usually is said to have a common homeland, right? So there's a territorial border that says this is what the nation state is. You have similar laws and customs. You probably have a similar language. You have a government, right? I mean, the government becomes this thing which dictates what is a nation. And so there's this taken for granted notion that a nation is this very clearly defined thing which has a government, which has laws, which has territory, etc., etc. But actually, in reality, that's a total and utter myth. If you think about the United Nations, which is the place that says what the nations are and how many nations we have, the official place for defining nations, only about 10% of the nations within the United Nations would actually meet all of those criteria. Actually, nations aren't, we treat nations as this kind of naturally existing thing. They are not at all. It's a heavily ideological, political tool used to control people largely. It isn't this natural thing, this natural container. Now, there's a term in the sociologist Herminio Martins uses where he says that methodological nationalism is like the worst thing to happen to sociology. And by methodological nationalism, what he means is if you actually think about sociology, politics, any subject, we automatically start with the nation state. So take the idea of class, for example, and there is a British class schema. Well, it's ridiculous. How can you have a British class schema? What happens in Britain is important and connected to what happens in Jamaica, etc., etc., etc. In the British class schema, the working class is defined by a certain way, and then it just stops, right? But if you actually look at the industrial relations historically, which go back to slavery and colonialism, and certainly the industrial relations today, where are your products made? The sweatshop labor, resource extraction from Africa. An actual class system that would have to be global, surely, right? And would actually put the working class in the UK would be very, very high in that global class schema, actually. The poorest person in the UK is in the top 80% of earners in the entire world, right? But methodological nationalism, we close that off and we just say, well, what's the British class system? And how do you compare that to the American class system, etc., etc. Which really makes no sense at all, really closes down avenues. And one of the things that the Garveyism was really pushing back against was the idea of the nation state. It becomes a really influential idea then, because what Garvey basically says, look, Africa for the Africans. That's the slogan, if you like, that captures people. It says, well, one Africa is for all of us, and it's for all Africans, and even those Africans who were taken out. So me, I'm still an African, even though I live here. And my allegiance then, and this is the important thing nationally, my allegiance isn't to Britain or isn't to Jamaica or any of those other nations. My allegiance is to black people, right? The global black nation, which really challenges all of our politics. Because all of our politics is oriented around Britain, etc. And to the extent that it is national, it is oriented around how, as British people, how do we connect to other nation states? There is a strong argument on the radical side here. The nation state is one of the biggest problems in terms of getting real revolutionary change. If you think about, and particularly if you think about the nation states in Africa or in the Caribbean, as I said with Jamaica, for example, that is, black people are not supposed to be in Jamaica. We're only in Jamaica because of slavery. There's only so many people on the island because of slavery. It's not a natural occurring thing, and it's created this position of poverty, etc. And if you think about the resources which are still extracted from the Caribbean, how it's still exploited, actually there's a large, strong argument to say that the economics of the Caribbean, particularly somewhere like Jamaica, just can't work in the long term, which is why we're seeing continued poverty, continued problems, etc., etc., etc. And actually, and this is where Garveyism comes in and says, well, look, it's not supposed to work. That's a problem. It's time to go back to Africa. On the African continent, you can see the nonsense of the nation most clearly. So I want to say there's about 54 countries on the African continent. None of those countries are decided or divided up by Africans. They're all divided up by Europeans, who in the Berlin Conference in 1885 literally sat down with a map and drew straight lines on a map and said, this is a country, this is a country, this is a country. And the fact that we maintain those borders has created so much conflict and problems on the African continent. But because we're so wed to the idea of the nation state, we don't challenge it, right? And we still have Ghanaian politics, Nigerian politics, etc., etc., etc. And what Garveyism is about saying, no, we need to get rid of all of that, see ourselves, the nation is the people, wherever we are part of that nation, and our allegiance is to each other. So there is this radical connection of unity that brings all of us together no matter what. And that really is the glue and the thing that makes Garveyism very, very different. And you can see the influence of that onwards in terms of, there's even a flag. So there's the red, black and green flag, which you may have seen, comes from the Garvey movement. And the red represents the bloodshed shed by African people. The black is black people. And the green is the land of Africa. And this becomes a national emblem. And if you just want to see the influence of Garveyism, look at the African flags. So Ghana's flag, for example, Kenya's flag, for example, incorporate those colors, right? They really are. Even though Garvey never went to Africa, he's probably the most influential thinker on the African continent with these ideas of unity, with this idea of continental nationalism, with the flag, etc. The Ghanaian flag, you can actually see there's a black star in the middle of it. That is directly from the Black Star Line, right? The return to Africa. So it's a really influential idea about how we see the world differently. And nationalism is really the big thing. The global black nation is a concept which is obviously useful for black people, but it's useful to dismantle that kind of taken for granted idea of what a nation is. So the perfect example of the myth of the nation kind of is the United Kingdom, right? If you ask somebody, how many countries are in the United Kingdom? Is Scotland a country? Is England a country? Is Wales a country? Northern Ireland a country? I mean, you could say they all have. Scotland has a parliament, Northern Ireland has a parliament, Wales has a parliament. You could make the argument they have different cultures and different customs. Scotland certainly feels like it is independent to somewhere like England. So you could make all these arguments that actually there's 4 countries on these islands. But actually, technically, there's not. Technically, there's one. There's one government, there's one law, there's one set of laws which might be slightly different between the different regions, but by the UN standard nation-state definition, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the place that gives you your passport, that's the country. That's it. There's no more. There's not more than that. But again, just shows you how limited this idea of the nation-state is. Because even in this relatively small space, there's lots and lots of arguments for these different countries. And so that's important too, because we need to think about other ways of thinking about how to build a nation and what a nation is. And that kind of revolutionary black radicalism, or this idea of a global nation, is one of those perfectly legitimate ways to think about a nation. So when I say, like, to my kids, black is a country, they all look at me and laugh because that's ridiculous. But actually, when you really think about it, it's no more ridiculous than saying Scotland's a country, right? It's all about the perception and where we're coming from. The nation state isn't an objective thing that just exists. It's something we have to agree exists. And there are many other ways we can see and understand what a nation is.